Hello everybody. Now I have another issue based on my last video related to evolution on is another hole that I think is involved in evolution, and again it involves sex. And sex, I believe personally, is one of the greatest gifts that God has given us. The issue that has come up by, I believe his name was Ask Egg, who actually was the most respectful responder and most eloquent responder, so I appreciate that. But he did point out one of the basic elements of natural selection and evolution, which is the idea that new species are created based on, or new features occur in a particular species because that new feature is particularly advantageous to survival. Okay, so I'm going to go to a very basic level of that involving sex. If the very first creatures that occurred through evolution, let's say our ancestor, our basic ancestor that first had the ability to reproduce itself, presumably because there were no sexual organs in this ancestor, assuming that it's true, so that ancestor could reproduce itself. That's correct. Isn't that more advantageous than the process of having to find another partner and to create a creature based on that? It's certainly more advantageous for survival to be able to reproduce oneself than it would be to have to do it and end up potentially tainting one's own gene pool by joining with someone else's entirely. So that's my first point. The second point is, assuming that you don't agree with that the female of the species that were eventually, had that common ancestor and developed the female sexual organs, why is it more advantageous for survival for a woman to get pregnant and risk her life and go through enormous amounts of pain in order to procreate when presumably the first woman who developed sexual organs would have been able to reproduce herself, right? So there's the big question. It's not more advantageous to survival, the whole sex thing. And on the converse, why would men want to reproduce with other partners when they would be able to presumably preserve their own gene pool and have direct descendants by asexually reproducing? Wouldn't it be more advantageous for them to simply be able to experience the pleasure of sex without having the finality of it, potentially, of impregnating a woman and thereby burdening oneself, when the man who was asexual could have the desire to reproduce anytime he wanted, as opposed to having to do it when by spontaneous potential. I don't know if that makes any sense, but you know what I mean. By unplanned pregnancy. It would be more advantageous for males who could reproduce themselves in that case to find partners, female partners, who could not conceive, who were proven to have had sexual intercourse many times, and then, but it was determined could not conceive. So it was a better chance for them to go that way, which would mean that the genes for sterility, but still the ability to reproduce oneself asexually, would have been more likely the final result for society. And we would today, should evolution be true, in my opinion, we would still have people that were reproducing asexually because it's a more efficient method. We don't, and that's interesting. And then this goes to another side that I just mentioned already. Now, sex is pleasurable. And why is that? Because it was more advantageous to survival for that to occur, so that there was no incentive. Isn't there an incentive of all creatures to want to reproduce themselves? That's the whole basis of life, is the reproduction of ourselves. And it is one of the basic tenets, I would presume, of evolution and natural selection, is the desire to continue the survival line. Could be completely wrong on that. You can correct me. But why aren't there a number of people out there that exist where sex doesn't feel good? Because presumably there were creatures where it didn't feel good and then it did, right? I mean, does that make sense? I don't know. I think the whole concept of sex feeling good as a whole is absolute evidence of the proof of the gift of sex from a higher power, from a creator. It didn't happen. It didn't have to happen that way. Pleasure to reproduce is not necessary, is it? And this is my final point on the issue, that presumably going back to advantageous changes in the genetic pool for survival isn't less complexity the best goal there. In other words, if evolution is true, I suspect, as I imagine evolutionists would suspect, that millions of years from now, potentially, if the human race still exists, the whole waste concept would be, bowels and urine would be completely changed around, because it would be more advantageous that way based on the time that we currently spend on the toilet or going to the bathroom. That's all. That could be. That's wasted time that could change, and eventually, perhaps we will be creatures that give off waste through, let's say, our pores, through sweat, which we do, I think, already. I'm not certainly the biology expert, but I did take some biology classes. I think that there are toxins that we release that way. So it might be the way in which we give off our waste in the future, because it's more efficient. So that being said, why is sex different? Why did sex become more complex? Why was that necessary for survival? And if you agree with me that it wasn't, then why don't we still have human beings that can asexually reproduce? I'm looking for responses to these questions. Maybe I allowed you to think a little bit, but maybe you can help me out by answering some of those questions. Maybe these have been addressed in certain books that you've read on evolution. Give some comments, give a video comment, whatever. I'm curious. Thanks.